Good morning and welcome to 23 Degrees Sideways. We're in the boat, right? We're in one of the boats. Man, don't collect junk boats. Actually, this is really great. We're getting close to leaving on the trip. We got to get through this cold front and this windstorm thing, and then I think we're going to be ready for the partial cruise. So this boat will end up being storage for a while, you know? We're getting it closed up, ready to go. Now, one of the things that is really interesting to me about taking the smaller Catalina on this trip, you know, it's outboard powered. It's designed that way. Not fully designed, like it's still a Catalina 27, but it was built with an outboard well, with the intention of it being powered by an outboard, and you know, to get you out of the slip, to get you sailing and everything. Now we're going down the ICW, we think. We're at least going to Norfolk. We'll see what happens, right? And assuming we go down the ICW, then there's no problem with the way it works right now. If we want to do anything more adventurous, or if I really want to do motoring in Chesapeake Bay in weather or something, then we might want to do some modifications to how this works, because the engine is so far back with the outboard well, and it's running behind the rudder, so when the boat goes up and down with waves, you hobby horse out. Your shaft comes out. No matter how long a shaft you put on there, practically speaking, the extra long shaft is like 25 inches, which you can't use. I'll get to that. Your prop's going to come out of the water. And that just kills your efficiency, your motion, everything. That's why the inboard motor is still the more popular thing to do with a cruising sailboat. Now, all of that being said, I could run a longer shaft lower down. I could get the engine down lower and everything if the rudder wasn't in the way. But the way the rudder is designed, it comes out just a little bit behind the boat. And if you get too far down with the prop shaft, you're going to run into the rudder. Another reason, props usually run in front of the rudder. Now, one of the ways to deal with that, of course, is to put the engine off to the side. And a lot of small sailboats, smaller than the 27, will have a side-mounted, in the well, outboard. So on one side of the back, the locker at the very rear of the boat, you've got a hole coming out the aft end where your prop shaft goes. So you've got a little motor in there, and then on the other side you've got your gas. No gas in the boat, no need to vent, everything's cool. You know, we have part of that, except the engine is mounted center, which is kind of more efficient. There's an answer to that, and the answer is to have one motor on either side, run smaller motors way down deep, so that you don't have the prop shafts popping out in normal weather, normal heavy weather, normal cruising weather. You know, when the weather gets extreme, the weather gets extreme. It's a 27-foot boat that only weighs, what, 5,000 pounds. Like, you're not gonna it's not going to sit and ride 8-foot seas comfortably. But we're not doing 8-foot seas. We're doing the Intracoastal Waterway and Chesapeake Bay and maybe Tampa Bay and stuff like that. I don't know if we're going to go to Florida. I'm still very iffy on Florida. Excuse my hair. It's actually a very windy day. I've already been out in it and gotten all windblown. The wind's picking up early this morning. So what I've been looking at is trying to figure out electric motor power values. And that's a really crazy, weird thing. And don't even bother to ask on a forum, because the only answer you're going to get on a forum is, don't do it. Electric motors aren't there yet. You'll never be able to do anything with it. And that's the answer. I've started 4 threads, different forums, and 3 out of 5 answers that I get is, don't do it, you can't do it. And then 1 answer out of 5 is somebody marketing something like a solar sail. Like, oh, hey, this sail will be a solar panel, maybe more power for your electric motor. Like, that's not the question I'm asking. The question I'm asking is about thrust and power. Can't test this on a forum. Apparently, you can't actually ask this and get a real answer anywhere on the internet. A friend of mine and I have both spent some hours researching, gathering data, looking at the numbers. No one... Okay. I have a 9.8 horsepower, call it 10 horsepower, outboard on the back of the Catalina 27. I have a 30 horsepower gasoline engine, Atomic 4, in this Tartan 34. Neither of them produce that much horsepower at normal operating ranges. So the outboard will produce 10 horsepower right up at like 4,800, 4,500 RPM or something. And it's actually designed to run pretty fast. Those outboards are designed to run that way. If you're going fast enough, okay, the prop design is that you're going 12, 15, 18 knots when you're up at that RPM. That's important, okay? Gasoline engines develop very little power outside of their power band, that specific range of RPM. So it's not a 9.8 horsepower engine to begin with, because we can't go more than 4.5, 5 knots. So no matter how much horsepower you put out, we're not going to go fast enough for that prop to do its job and do 10, 15 knots. Okay? Problem number one, and this is a huge problem with efficiency with outboards and sailboats. Planing hulls, you can actually make them do what they do. So it's not really a 10 horsepower motor. Now, if I change the prop, there is a high thrust prop that will give me more delivered power. Different problem, we're getting there. Costs $100. I can get it. I can probably get it at a store in Norfolk or whatever, get it delivered to a marina or something. I'm probably going to try that. Want to work on that. Want to see how that does. So, getting back to it, the Atomic 4 in this boat, with a well-designed propeller, and very few props were actually designed properly for the Atomic 4's operating range, will give me about 8 to 10 delivered horsepower at idle or just above idle cruising throttle, if I'm lucky. It's not 30 horsepower. It's just not. Now, technically speaking, a horsepower is 730 watts. So basically 700 watts is a horsepower. 1,000 watts is 1.25 horsepower. So you get these engines. I've got a trolling motor. It's an electric outboard motor. It's not designed to go fast. It's a trolling motor. The prop is designed to deliver a lot of torque and thrust at lower speeds. Okay, it's not supposed to take you over 3.5 knots, 4 miles an hour. Now, some of these will do, 10 amps, 20 amps, whatever, 40 amps of draw. And that, when you do that with 12 volts or even 24 volts, depends on the motor, right? These go from like 12 pounds of thrust to 102 pounds of thrust in regular commercial trolling motors. I have one that's technically 18 and one that's 55. Now, the 55-pound thrust is probably pushing 250 watts power consumption. Maybe 300. So, you could get up to saying, oh, maybe half a horsepower on a really good day of actual power, according to the energy input. The energy output, though, is pretty significant because it's designed to give 55 pounds of thrust. 55 pounds continuous push. And on a small dinghy, that with me and another person, and some gear, say 400 pounds, in a small 8.5-foot rigid dinghy, rigid inflatable, with a clean bottom, that's pushing us at 4 knots on the map. So, depending on currents and stuff, just call it 3.5, 4 miles an hour. Now that's fine. How many horsepower is that? No one knows. How many horsepower equivalent is that? That's the equivalent in thrust and speed and performance. It's the equivalent in going places to putting a 2.5 horsepower outboard on the same boat. Might get 1 or 2 more miles an hour more out of the 2.5 because I can just run that prop faster. And the prop is designed for higher speeds. But not a lot. So if I put a properly designed 88 100-pound thrust, 3/4, 1/2 to 2/3 to 3/4 horsepower, say 600 watt motor onto the dinghy, and the prop is designed right, I'm going to get 5 knots, maybe. You know, it's a very small boat, and there's limits to what happens, and then you have to start lifting the hull to hydroplane and so on and so forth. And I can take a 2 kilowatt motor, you know, 3 horsepower, and I can plane all day. It'll be the equivalent of having 6, 8, 9 horsepower on that dinghy, if the prop is designed right. None of that makes any sense, because you can't say that 1,500 watts is more than 2 horsepower. But if you run a 1,500 watt motor that's designed for hull speeds, designed to go 4, 5 knots with the prop design, you will have the equivalent of a 6 or 8 horsepower outboard or inboard motor. So it's all very crazy. None of this makes any sense. Horsepower is very much a lie, okay? And that's the problem. That's the problem here is we don't measure boat engines in pounds of thrust. We don't measure sailboat engines in pounds of thrust at 5 knots. And that's really what we should do. Pick an arbitrary thing. 5 knots, 5 kilometers an hour, 4 miles an hour. Pick a number. Pick something that is in the reasonable range of 70-80% of hull speed for a smallish boat. Get the pounds of thrust with proper prop design, and that is your motor rating. That would make sense, but no one does that. And you can't even do that. You can't measure the pounds of thrust of an atomic 4. You can find some research online, and you can get some guesses that, you know, you're going to get a couple 100 pounds of thrust with the right prop design at the right speed. And that's probably going to be near half throttle, and you're probably technically developing 12, maybe 16 horsepower, not 30 horsepower, because that's 3,800 RPM, and that's pretty much red line for a flathead design like this, and it's way too fast for the prop, and we're not running a planing hull, and you're not going to go 12 knots no matter how hard you push this boat, it'll sink. So, what do you need? If you have a reasonable prop design, probably, and the best answer I've been able to come up with is a 34-foot reasonably designed sailboat, traditional sailboat, should go 4.5, 5 knots into the weather, like against wind, not heavy storm, but into the weather, with 5 to 7 kilowatts of motor. And that's a big range, because 7 kilowatts, now you're talking about 10 horsepower. which is underpowered for this boat according to everybody who puts in a diesel engine. You can't put in an 8 or 10 or 12 horsepower diesel because you'll be very underpowered. Well, not if your prop design is right and the spin is right and everything, and you have enough room for the proper size prop with the way the shaft comes out, which you don't. Not on this boat, not on a Catalina, not on most sailboats. There's too many compromises in design. So, what do? Here's what you do. Take a Catalina 27 down the ICW and get ready and plan for some pod motors. And that's pretty much what we're doing. I don't know, like, I'm going to have to get the batteries together. I'm going to have to get the motors together. I'm going to have to mess with this a lot. But I think what we're going to end up doing over time, with some fiberglass and bracing and stuff, is try out some pods. An electric trolling motor is an engine pod at the end of a shaft. The shaft has wires that go from the motor controller to the pod. The motor itself is down there. It's the pod. It's not. there's no gears. There's no shaft. There's no nothing. The motor itself is down in the water, and that's fine. They're made to be in the water. So pods, motors, and probably what I'll do, because again, this is a slow boat designed to do slow boat things, I will probably start with a couple of the higher thrust range 24 volt commercial trolling motors. Newport 88, Minnetonka 102 pounds thrust, something like that. And I'll put 2 of them on, one on each end, and I can pretty much bolt these on. I don't have to remove my outboard. I don't have to do anything to make this work, except get a couple of motors, and they're a couple $100. You know, you can use them on the dinghy. They're backups. There's a whole lot of reasons. And then it's going to be a couple $100 of batteries. And by a couple, I mean probably 800. I'm going to have to get 2 24-volt batteries to do that. And this isn't getting into a professional 48-volt system, but this is a 27-foot boat, so we'll see. This also is not designed to be a long-range battery system. I just want enough battery to know that the system works, right? Once I know the system works, then I can expand the battery bank and start talking about how to make this really work. I think that this is going to be crucial for reviving or rescuing or reusing or getting more people out or whatever, more rebellion, more freedom, smaller sailboats. A lot of people are very into the bigger sailboats. Like this one that I'm on right now, this is a 34-foot boat. And it's designed for a race crew. So you need to do some remodeling to make it a really comfortable liveaboard. But it's 7 feet longer than the Catalina 27 and doesn't have a whole lot more usable space. So it's a little funky to think about that way. Moving past that just a little bit, the considerations are that going back to those 30s, the 29s, the 27-foot boats, where you can cruise comfortably, they're cheap. They're really cheap. Most of them have motor problems. A lot of them have engine problems, and that's one of the reasons you can buy these for $1,000 quite often, is that the motor's dead. Motors are the bane of existence, and some people, you know, translate that into anti-motor sentiment. I hate engines on sailboats. I will be the green person, green police. And it's like, well, yeah, you can do that, but the truth is, if you want to go places, in a lot of situations, if you're not doing an ocean passage with the trade winds, you need that. You need to motor sometimes, you know, you're going to be waiting along sometimes months, you know, there's stuff. And go comfortably, go with the wind, use the wind as much as possible, but have an efficient, reasonable, reliable, simple motor system. If you can do that with a couple of sticks, metal pods, firm mounts, really good mounts, on the back or aft quarter of a sailboat, and they go down deep enough that they actually work, well, you just solved a lot of trouble, and you got rid of the engine, and you're now reliant on batteries. And the batteries can be expensive, and you have to take care of them, replace them, but that's not hard to do. And then you start looking at people starting to try to be more efficient. Like some of the van lifers, they're like, how small and fuel efficient a vehicle can I get into so that I can actually travel? And it's a whole different mindset from people who want to live aboard a 50-foot boat with one person because they want to have a full-sized house on the water. Well, you're not doing that. But the problem is that no one knows how strong any of these engines actually are in a non-traditional environment. You put an inboard electric motor, you just replace the gasoline engine that's down there, that's why I keep gesturing that way, with an big fat electric motor, and you run it, and it'll be whatever, 5, 7, 10 kilowatts. People have recommended 15 kilowatts, 72 volt systems for a 34-foot sailboat, and I'm like, you don't need that. I know that you don't need that because I know what you're actually pushing. But that's the equivalent in horsepower terms, but that's not the equivalent in power delivery terms, because the electric motor is going to deliver, with a decent prop, is going to deliver much better power. So you can do a direct replacement, but you don't get any efficiency. You don't have a better prop design. You don't have a better speed range. You're not making use of the torque ranges of the electric motor. So you don't have an equivalence. There's a big problem here, is the equivalence. What is the horsepower equivalence is the question. And you turn that around and you say, how many pounds of thrust do you actually develop with your Atomic 4, with this classic two-bladed prop that they put on all of them, if you're pulling against the dock? Well, okay, but what is the pounds of thrust if you're actually moving at 3 knots instead of pulling against the dock? Like, all these measurements are very difficult to come up with. As far as I can tell, at displacement speeds, so we're talking 3 to 6 miles an hour, smaller boats, okay? You might get 7 knots with a longer hull on a bigger sailboat, right? 8 miles an hour. But let's just go with that basic 5 knots, okay, max. As far as I can tell, 15 pounds of thrust is not equivalent to horsepower, but 45 pounds of thrust might be equivalent to 2 horsepower. 90 pounds of thrust might be equivalent to 4, might be equivalent to 6 when you're talking about an engine or an outboard. So, you know, it's very rough and very loose, but everyone calculates things, labels things in horsepower. 200 pounds of thrust, okay, pushing off with your legs continuously, is going to be enough to make a Catalina 27 go pretty well in most weather. It's just, it's a fairly efficient thing, you know, a clean hull on water. So there you go, a couple 100 pounds of thrust. We're going to try it. And that's about it. That's what I've come up with. Coming up with amp draws and actual power in terms of watts used, we will look at that. I'll measure that. I'll measure that on 12 volt. I'll measure it on 24 volt. I'll measure it on 36 and 48 volt, I'm sure. But that's where we're at. That's where you're stuck at, is trying to figure out what the pounds of thrust actually are. And then, of course, what the pounds of thrust are what the actual pounds of thrust being delivered by the labeled motors is. That's another thing. And I don't know how you measure that. The only thing I can do is record data at speed in real world conditions and see how it goes. Because there isn't a conversion, there isn't an answer. And honestly, no one knows. Except catamaran people, and they follow a different set of rules. So, that's it. That's my long, rambling video for one of the projects that we're doing on the Catalina over time. If you want to help that project, you know, there's always the Cash App links and whatever, and I'll get the Patreon working someday, and we'll work on that. Subscribe, give it a like, share this, you know, all my wacky posting. All right, stay sideways.